Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Paddy in the studio.
And it's Adam in the studio.
And shortly it'll be Lyse in Munich. We'll let you know when she joins us.
And we're recording this episode of Newscast on Saturday morning at 11:40. And one of the kind of new routines of Saturday mornings, which you and Laura know very well, Paddy, is that this is when Hamas usually releases Israeli hostages. Although all this week, whether they were going to do that today was kind of in jeopardy.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, it looked like Hamas had given up on the idea. That produced a furious response in the White House where Donald Trump said, right, if they're not released, and actually he implied all 79 rather than the 3 that was under this stage of the deal, he said, let hell rain loose. That's basically what he said. So you could argue, and I think many people will argue, that this release is a victory for Donald Trump's diplomacy, his fiery diplomacy. But like everything, there is argument over whatever happens in the Middle East. However, against all odds, let's just put it that way, 3 Israeli hostages have walked free. And in return, Israel is releasing Palestinian prisoners.
And the 3 hostages released by Hamas today are Alexander Trivanov, a 29-year-old Russian-Israeli, Yahir Horn, a 46-year-old Argentine-Israeli, and Sagi Dekelchan, a 36-year-old American-Israeli. And I think what was interesting for me, Paddy, is we talk about the 3 stages of this ceasefire deal with kind of like the picture that they're negotiating over broadening out with each stage. But what this week has shown is that there were stages within each stage because Hamas's threat to not go ahead with today's release was designed to put pressure on Israel to let more aid and tents into Gaza, and presumably was part of a strategy to apply pressure for the further stages. So you can't just think of like stage 1, 2 and 3. It's almost like daily set of negotiations.
Yeah, and also I find myself still finding it unbelievable that the 2 sides who are committed to each other's destruction and are in fact fighting each other in the West Bank have called a ceasefire in Gaza and have got some representatives talking, sometimes through proxies, to do the actual architecture of a hostage release. On the face of it, it's unbelievable. But because we're living in the middle of the most volcanic news cycle that any of us can ever remember, it almost seems, oh, yes, it's another hostage release. But it's not that. It's absolutely and utterly remarkable. It means everything to the Israeli families. This business of getting the hostages back is absolutely everything to them. And when Palestinian prisoners go back to West Bank, for instance, they are greeted as heroes. So it is causing the most extraordinary ripples throughout this country, which has been this area, which has been at this awful existential war. So you find it to be unbelievable at the same time as you say the names.
And just talking about the news cycle speeding up, I mean, it was 4 days ago that all the conversations were dominated by, is Trump really serious about America owning Gaza, taking all the Palestinians out, rebuilding it and turning it into a sort of like Riviera on the other side of the Mediterranean, and then letting some of the Palestinians back in? And that was everything that we were talking about at the start of the week. But then that one phone call between Trump and Vladimir Putin completely reset the conversation to be about something else.
Yeah, and that was unexpected by the Europeans, who felt that Ukraine had been sidelined. So President Zelensky of Ukraine has been addressing European leaders today, and he's been calling this week, at the end of the week, he's been calling for a new sort of European army, and that's after the phone call. And so the reset, if you can call it that, caused by the inauguration of Donald Trump basically just weeks ago, has meant one of the biggest shocks to Europe, I think, since Brexit. I'm going to ask the German ambassador to rate the shock. I'm going to shockometer about what J.D. Vance in particular has been saying about European values.
What will you do if he gives you a German number?
Well, I would have to...
9, 8. Actually, you're a Eurovision veteran, so you can do German numbers, can't
Well, they don't do them in German. They do them in French.
All right, okay.
But I do need to know, on the shockosphere. Well,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Right. Well,
I think that's 1 to 10.
Well, I think it's going to be Zayn.
Yeah, or 9.
Right.
Because you always want to leave a bit of headroom for things to get even more chaotic.
Well, they certainly are. So
yes.
I think we can say they certainly are going to. Lovely. And guess what? From the Munich conference is a staggered BBC chief international correspondent, Lyse Doucet. Lyse, how staggered are you on the stagometer?
Now, are you looking at staggered as staggered by the sub-zero temperatures, staggered by some of the unexpected speeches, can I say, that we're hearing at the Munich Security Conference, or perhaps staggered by the number of BBC requests because there's so much interest in what's happening in Munich this year, and with good reason.
Well, let's go with the unexpected speeches. What is the impact on European leaders of having European values questioned by J.D. Vance, or some people now pronouncing him Vance?
Well, I think they would regard it as part of any democratic tradition, that you can have your own views and you can question them, discuss them. But it was unexpected and quite shocking, I think, for many of the delegates in that packed hall yesterday here in Munich, that when the American vice president, the head of the US delegation to the Munich Security Conference, which is a forum which is meant to celebrate and strengthen the transatlantic partnership and is meant to focus on the main security issues of the day, they were expecting J.D. Vance, after he said he was thrilled to be here, how much he valued this partnership, that he would give more details about the issue on most people's minds, which was, how would America and Europe work together on issues like ending the war in Ukraine? Instead, they got a lecture about democratic values, that he accused them of censoring information, of censoring the political freedoms in Europe. He suggested that why was America supporting European countries if they weren't allowing the kind of democratic freedoms and the values that America held dear? And he singled out particular countries for what he saw as their violations. In Britain, he looked at Britain, saying that Britain was backsliding on religious rights. So I think the audience was stunned. Obviously, there was very little applause throughout his entire speech, but it left the delegates reeling. I mean, even the defense minister of Germany, Boris Pistorius, said afterwards that it was as if he was trying to look at European societies through the lens of autocratic regimes.
And let's hear how J.D. Vance talked about the biggest threat to Europe being not China or Russia, but itself. This is how he put it.
And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. Most concerningly,
and listening to his speech, I think I wrote down 6 examples he gave where democracy or freedom of speech had been threatened in Europe. And 2 of those examples were Britain. And at least one of them he didn't get quite right. Because I looked into it afterwards, he was talking about how in some parts of Scotland, it's now illegal to pray in your own home. And actually what that is about creating these buffer zones outside abortion clinics where it's illegal to protest either for or against. And that also includes if your home is next door to an abortion clinic. And it's not that you can't pray inside your own home as a result of this. It's that you can't put stuff on your windows that could be counted as a protest or making a comment on abortion. So he took something where there's a grain of truth, planted it, poured loads of water on it, and then delivered a big plant that was actually kind of not really accurate. But interesting how many of the examples were British. And also, Lyse, he referred to the car ramming attack in Munich that had happened the day before, and we can listen to him linking that to another one of his criticisms of Europe, which was about levels of immigration into the continent.
We saw the horrors wrought by these decisions yesterday in this very city. And of course, I can't bring it up again without thinking about the terrible victims who had a beautiful winter day in Munich ruined. Our thoughts and prayers are with them and will remain with them. But why did this happen in the first place? It's a terrible story, but it's one we've heard way too many times in Europe and unfortunately too many times in the United States as well. An asylum seeker, often a young man in his mid-20s, already known to police, rams a car into a crowd and shatters a community. How many times must we suffer these appalling setbacks before we change course and take our shared civilization in a new direction?
And Lyse, what do you think J.D. Vance's strategy was here? What was his objective beyond just annoying everyone in the room who was listening to him?
Which seems to suggest that why was the United States spending so much money providing for the security of Europe, providing support for European nations when he saw it, and obviously he was speaking for President Trump's administration, that it didn't share the same values. But quite frankly, many are questioning, well, what was all that about? You know, on top of everything else, it wasn't just what he said, it was what he did in what was seen as a violation of the protocol of this conference. He also met with the leader of Germany's far-right AfD party just days before an election in Germany. Now, his office had said they didn't give details of the meeting. They said that J.D. Vance met with leaders of all Germany's major political parties. But of course, as has been reported extensively before, Elon Musk, who's some people say is the real vice president in the United States, he's been having meetings. He's been having debates, publicized debates with the far-right AfD and suggesting that they are the best political partner for the United States. So I don't know about you, it felt a little bit Elon Musk-like. I kept thinking, I wonder who wrote his speech and what was behind his decision to take this approach to his moment on this major stage.
I mean, I've been looking at the history of isolationism and America Firstism over the past century. And
it's not new.
It's not new. And it's been very much sort of telegraphed that we were expecting an America First White House. And this really was the biggest encapsulation of it for me as a European. It's hard for me to, at least being Canadian, you're uniquely able to feel what it means to describe Canada as a 51st state and its prime minister as a governor, which has happened several times now. But for me, this came home as a European, and I lived in the States a long time. And Americans have every right to say, you European guys, after 80 years of us paying, can you just sort out your own security? Can you stop arguing? And by the way, we don't like your politics in Brussels. That's a large part of what the Brexit vote was. And there will be newscasters who get the message, actually, that Europe can be criticised as being overregulated, as having a big problem that its elites can't address. That's kind of what J.D. Vance is saying, and he's perfectly entitled to say it, and it fits with America First-ism. And the other thing about it is that Lyse knows better than anyone by being there that although it's all right to say that in the US, to bring that speech to the heart of Germany days before its election is absolutely knowingly to interrupt the flow of European events. It's disruption with a capital D. And I say again, he's perfectly entitled. They've been elected with this view, perfectly entitled to articulate it. But it's so knowing the way it's happened within days to speak by telephone to President Putin, bring him out of the cold before he spoke to President Zelensky, whilst they were meeting. That's what it is. That whatever you put that into a word, that's why I asked Lyse how staggered is she, because I think that's a phrase.
And it'll be so interesting seeing the UK domestic implications of this, because if you think back to earlier this week, President Macron of France was having this big artificial intelligence summit in Paris. And the two of the countries that didn't sign the communique at the end of it were the United States and the UK. And people are saying there's an example of Keir Starmer now aligning himself diplomatically and economically more with Donald Trump. And of course, we learned in the Oval Office last night, and a little aside from Donald Trump, that Keir Starmer is going to be there in the Oval Office with him either next week or the week after. So we've got a more precise time frame for that visit now. But I just wonder if J.D. Vance is saying, oh, you guys have got to shift from your free speech clarifying, hate speech clamping down kind of mindset of the past. Will we start seeing European leaders like Keir Starmer having to shift more in that direction? Because that's what you've got to do to get stuff out of the White House, like avoiding the very specific set of tariffs that Donald Trump is now about to implement. Right, Lyse, shall we talk about Ukraine? So as we're speaking now, and it's now just before midday on Saturday UK time, it seems to me that the big event in Munich today has been this panel discussion between foreign ministers and Volodymyr Zelensky about a potential peace plan.
Well, the day began, I think the one of the main interests here was when President Zelensky took to the stage himself and gave a very strongly worded speech, a very strong message to Europe, basically. He basically agrees with the United States, but I have to say European leaders also agree that they have to do much more, spend much more for their own defense. And I think that message has been taken on by everyone here at the Munich Security Conference. But then President Zelensky went even further and said that the Europeans had to set up a European army, a special force, that they had to stop kidding themselves, as President Zelensky saw it, and that if they were going to be serious about protecting Europe, taking on that responsibility, then they needed a European army. Well, shortly after that, I spoke to the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Kaja Kallas. I think she was a bit taken aback by that suggestion. Her immediate reaction was, well, we've already got NATO, and right now, quite frankly, we're trying to work on ensuring a strong strategic partnership with the United States so that NATO continues to be a significant military force, and every European government has its own army. We know we don't need another army, but that was certainly the message from President Zelensky. And of course, it comes from a Ukrainian leader who is now, I mean, put yourself in his shoes or his boots. He's hearing not only is President Trump going his own way with his own particular style of being the world's peacemaker by talking directly for 90 minutes on the phone to President Putin, turning from what the world would regard as a pariah into a partner, but also that the Americans are saying, well, when it comes to the security guarantees, you're not going to join NATO, and it's Europe who's going to provide those security guarantees. Well, President Zelensky's message has been he wants a NATO guarantee, and many European countries agree with him on that. But if it's not going to be NATO, in order for that security guarantee to stop President Putin from trying to get even more territory from Ukraine, if not beyond, it has to be the United States has to be involved in every which way, boots on the ground, financially, with a very strong message to President Putin: don't you dare move another inch.
And Paddy, I've been getting a bit obsessed about this phrase security guarantees, because everyone says it as if everyone knows what it means, but then no one spells out what it does actually mean. And I realize it's a bit of it's got a meaning in the diplomatic and security context, but sometimes it sounds like a bit of a euphemism. So when I was interviewing the former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen on Newsnight last night, he's former Danish Prime Minister, finished being the head of NATO in 2014. I said to him, can you just tell us what this actually means? And he explicitly said, it means a multinational military force, and the version he conjured up on the spot was one led by Britain and France, but with Germany and the Netherlands and Poland and the Baltics helping out, of troops stationed in Ukraine, 50 to 100,000 of them, for potentially a few decades. And so I thought, at last somebody is actually going out on a limb here and actually spelling out in numbers and words what a security guarantee would be. And then you just think, though, like that sort of commitment, those numbers for that long in this world, with national finances as they are and attitudes to the military spending as they are, that would be a hard sell, wouldn't it, to the population? Well, it's certainly a very different sell to the population from what we've had for the last 20 years.
If you take one member of the population who used to actually run the army, Lord Dannatt, he told the BBC that we haven't got the forces to be able to do it. He described the British army's run down. I should say that the Ministry of Defence has said in reply that our armed forces are respected around the world. And I think that both things can be true at the same time, because military people have been saying for a very long time we are understaffed, under-resourced, and they want more money, and everyone wants more money. Rachel Reeves hasn't got any money, and neither have they got it in Germany, where they've got a recession. So that's the impact. That's the thing that Lyse, as she always does, has reminded us. Quite a lot of people would say the American message is correct. It is time for Europe to pay more for its defence. But we are not used to doing it. We have been under the umbrella of America's leadership in European security guarantees, to use your phrase, for a very long time. And this is the moment of change. Everything is changing, and that's why people are listening to Newscast, because they want to know what Lyse thinks about it, not what
not what we think.
But I would say that you've asked the right question by asking Rasmussen what is security guarantees. And inevitably, Lyse, will we see the first test of public opinion is coming in the German elections? Will we all be here in a couple of weeks saying how these ripples have been seen at the ballot box in one country, Germany?
Well, I think that we've been seeing them in ballot boxes across Europe, indeed across the world. First of all, as we've been discussing about incumbents being kicked out last year by and large, but with the rise of the far-right nationalist parties, everyone has their eye on just how well the AfD will be how they will fare in these elections in the aftermath of this another incident involving, in that case, an Afghan asylum seeker, which again has highlighted the increasingly sensitive issue of immigration in Germany. It's a political football, as it has been in Britain's election, in the American election. So, and there is this, and J.D. Vance again took aim at this, the fact that there's this firewall that political parties in Germany, after the Second World War, saying that they will not cooperate with far-right parties. But those kind of walls are starting to come down, and we'll wait and see what the verdict of the people of Germany are. But these are certainly times are changing, and the mood of the electorate is changing because the issues on the agenda are changing, and people's lives are changing. Cost of living, immigration, as we know the issues affecting the people of Britain are not so different from the issues affecting people everywhere.
And Lyse, just going back to potential negotiations about the fate of Ukraine, two questions. First is, do we have any more clarity on what the US position actually is? Because if you listened to Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary in Brussels on Wednesday, it sounded like one thing. But then if you listen to other members of the administration and briefings from Washington over the succeeding days, it sounded like a slightly different thing. What's your take on what you think the Americans are prepared to do or offer?
What we've heard from Ukrainian MPs who are here, Ukrainian observers, they're listening very closely, and it doesn't add up because we are hearing contradictory versions of what the United States is planning when President Trump says he wants to, well, first of all, he had said during his election campaign he would end the war in a day. His new envoy to Ukraine, retired General Keith Kellogg, he's a guy who does have a lot of experience on the ground when it comes to security matters. He has said he needs 100 days. And in fact, he's going to be speaking today in Munich, and we're hoping to hear more details from him. And then after Munich, he's actually heading to Kyiv. So you get a sense from Keith Kellogg is that he understands there's got to be a step-by-step process involving Ukraine, involving the Russians, involving the United States. Whereas Ukraine's fear had been President Trump gave the impression that he could do it leader to leader with President Putin, and he seemed to be, judging by the comments that were made by the American Defense Secretary Peter Hegseth when he addressed NATO, they were taking off the table the very issues that were going to be front and center in the negotiations, saying it was unrealistic, to use his word, that Ukraine would ever join NATO, unrealistic for Ukraine to expect that could ever return to its pre-2014 borders. The borders, of course, that's when Russia first invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea later. And it was unrealistic, of course, that the Americans would be involved in any future European security guarantees for Ukraine. And so Ukraine was shocked, as many Europeans were shocked, to say, well, excuse me, are these, you're just giving it away? And in the sort of the language of Munich, you are rewarding President Putin for his aggression. This, as they see it, let's use the language they use here, but a rules-based international order, that you don't reward countries for seizing another country's territory by force.
And Lyse, you answered my second question, which is what's the actual process we think is going to happen? And it sounds like from what you were saying, a more kind of classic negotiation process is about to begin with Kellogg going to Kyiv. Lyse, thank you very much for bringing us up to date with all the goings on in Munich. An incredibly eventful edition of the Munich Security Conference. Can I just end with a very nerdy point? And hopefully this doesn't put people to sleep, but I think it's quite interesting. So one of the things the EU has announced in the last day or so as part of their effort to kind of step up to the plate when it comes to defence is some reforms to what's known as the excessive deficit procedure. So this rule that the EU has that if a country's budget deficit is beyond a certain amount, they get a slap on the wrist from Brussels. Some countries get a bigger slap on the wrist than others. For example, France seems to be allowed to get away with it. They have tweaked that now so that military spending does not contribute to your budget deficit. So you can basically spend more, borrow more, go into more debt as a country if you're buying ammunition and tanks and soldiers. I just wonder if you're a British Chancellor who wants to stick to her fiscal rules and has already once redefined what the definition of debt is to help her meet her fiscal rules and spend more, could you take a leaf out of Brussels' book and maybe tweak the fiscal rules again so you can spend a bit more on defence without breaking your fiscal rules? Just putting it out there.
Well, I love that you put it out there, because this is the podcast that said long before she did change her fiscal rules that she would have to change her fiscal rules.
Besniffle.
Because fiscal rule is really designed to be changed anyway. It's a bit like the rules of the Eurovision Song Contest, to be perfectly honest.
Well, you're the expert in that.
Well, they invent them and change them, and that kind of is perfectly within the gift of a chancellor to change what the rule is.
Lyse, just before you go, I absolutely love Munich, and I mean the Christmas markets in Munich are amazing. They have about like 8 or 9 of them. Will you have time to have a big beer and a pretzel?
Well, since I avoid gluten, I've had great sourdough bread.
Okay.
And what else have I had?
Water.
Potato fritters.
Have you had some?
I love them with applesauce. Love them.
Have you had some lovely sparkling
but
water?
no beer for me. I'm on the job. I have to have. It's hard enough figuring out exactly what's happening in Munich without having one's brain clouded by beer.
Good to know what kind of cakes I should or shouldn't bring you next time. So, Lyse, I'll just say, Lyse, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Newscast.
It was a pleasure, as always, to be with you and Paddy.
Thank you.
I wish we were talking peace, not war, but we have to take the world as it is.
A few more decades of Newscast to go. Paddy, thanks very much for having me in your weekend lair.
No, I think it's absolutely right. It feels that it's gone up a gear. You're here. It's right. Everything in the garden is correct. Because I haven't seen you in person since the in-person Broadcasting House edition.
Oh, yes.
We turned it into Podcasting House.
Yeah.
We met
For
newscasters.
2.5 hours.
Well, you were on for a lot more, but we met newscasters face to face. And many of them have been listening to you since it started. And I think they just want the truth, as much as possible. But I think the thing is, if I had to boil it down to I mentioned at the start, I can't remember a news cycle like it. And this week proves it.
Busy. And that's why you need a news podcast available every day, Monday to Sunday on BBC Sounds like this one. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Newscast from the BBC.